and thank you all for joining us at the Sydney Dialogue for this session on global technology governance. I'm Laura Jays, host of EAM Agenda on Sky News Australia. It is a great honour to be speaking with such an eminent panel today from various corners of the globe, of course, and thank you all for being here. I'm also pleased to announce that this session will be streamed as part of the Bengaluru Tech Summit, Asia's largest technology event. And let me start by introducing our panel. Nick Clegg, the Vice President of Global Affairs and Communications at Meta. From 2010 to 2015, Nick also served as the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. In 2018, he was awarded a knighthood in recognition of his political and public service. Dr. Subramanian Jaishankar, India's Minister for External Affairs. Dr. Jaishankar was President of Global Corporate Affairs at Tata Sons Private Limited from May of 2018. He's also previously held the position of Foreign Secretary and has been Ambassador to the US and China at different times, of course, among a number of other diplomatic missions. Marise Payne, Australia's Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Women. Senator Payne also served as Defence Minister for 3 years, the first woman to do so in that cabinet portfolio. Please welcome our panellists, and I remind our audience that this is an open discussion that we encourage you to be a part of on Twitter as well. So please use the hashtag TSD2021. Towards the end of this discussion, there are some pre-submitted questions from our delegates as well. But let's get straight into it. Thank you to our panellists once again. Before we get into the detail of how we best shape global technology, should we start by acknowledging the biggest emerging challenges when it comes to tech, governance and maintaining democratic values? Minister Payne, first to you, what do you see as the biggest challenges here?
Thanks, Laura, and can I acknowledge the other participants today, and also thank ASPI very much for the invitation to participate in this very important dialogue. I think there's a number of challenges that we've been focused on in recent times, and particularly currently the use of technology or abuse of technology for disinformation. That is where we see governments that might want to undermine stability elsewhere for their own strategic purposes, but also, and dangerously so, non-state actors and individuals, for example, engaging in COVID and vaccine disinformation, which we know in a pandemic literally costs lives. I'm also very focused in both of my roles on online harms against women and girls, whether that is abuse or stalking or harassment, and finding ways to address this by governments, but also ensuring that our technology companies assume their own responsibilities in this area. We've been very determined and taken strong action in this particular policy space. And finally, where there might be misuse of technology by more authoritarian regimes and actors, including the oppression of people in terms of mass surveillance or foreign interference, where we've seen the use of cyber and social media, for example, in elections. So we're all very alert to that, and they are, I think, three of the challenges that I can see.
Yeah, the challenge are many and varied. Dr. Jaishankar, does India's views at all diverge, or are they divergent from what has just been outlined by the Minister?
First of all, Laura, good to join the panel. Look, by and large, I think I agree with what Marise just stated. But I also, it's also, if you look at it not with a sense of immediacy, but over a period of time, the fact is, technology has always mattered. Technology has always been a double-edged sword. It has brought good, but with every good that it has brought new vulnerabilities and new challenges. And this is not unique to the digital age. It has always been so. Now, what is different today? I think what is different today is that the impact it has on our daily lives, on our culture, on our psychology, on our behavior is something of a totally different order. And what it has done is, at one level, it has raised issues of privacy, of accountability. But as you know, two of us are today foreign ministers, and I just want to share with you a sort of, international relations kind of perspective of what today big tech means. If you look at it, the size of Apple, the market cap of Apple is more than the GDP of Italy. Microsoft is the size of Canada. Amazon is the size of South Korea. Google is the size of Australia. Facebook is bigger than Turkey. So you have private or companies who are of a scale and a size which human history hasn't seen. And their implications for what happens within societies, between societies, I think is something very, very profound and is something we should be debating. So apart from the issues which Maurice raised, I think there are questions about regulations, about practices, I would say even about culture. And I was just reading something which Nick Clegg had written for, I assume, for the dialogue, and where the need for regulation of finding the right balance has been addressed. And I think that's a very, very legitimate issue.
Mr. Clegg, I think profound is the right word used there by Dr. Jai Shankar. I assume, you're coming to this panel with a different perspective than the other two foreign ministers. How do you see the challenges? And I assume you don't think they're insurmountable.
Yeah, can I also join the others by thanking you, Laura, for hosting this. And it's a great honour to be on this panel with Minister Payne and Minister Jai Shankar. And since you mentioned cricket, I feel like I just can't help but mention rugby, since I'm a rugby fan. But I won't dwell on it any more than that. That would be undiplomatic for me to do so. Much though I relish the result myself. I think everything that has been touched on already are clearly some of the key issues. The issues of sovereignty. You have these huge private sector companies which are making adjudications on their own, if you like, in a regulatory vacuum for issues which touch on very significant social, ethical, political and cultural matters in jurisdictions around the world. And quite understandably, governments around the world, I was in politics myself for 20 years, quite understandably, the political classes around the world want to rebalance that and want to make sure that the public sphere is sort of framing and placing guardrails through law and through regulation within which these private sector companies operate. The balance between all the good content that flows on the internet and obviously the bad content. I mean, in the case of the company that I work at, Meta, we have a third of the world's population, and however hard we try, we've now reduced hate speech on our platform such that there's only 3 items of hate speech out of every 10,000 pieces of content that you see. So it's down to 0.03%, which we've reduced the prevalence of hate speech in half over the last year. But even 0.03% is still a big number when you're dealing with 3 billion people on the platform. That is another issue. But I would probably single out the following issue as, in my view, the most important of all, and that is simply trying to keep the internet itself open. There's a great deal of talk about the global internet. The global internet doesn't exist. It's a fiction. It doesn't exist. We have an open internet, which is enjoyed by most democracies around the world, and then we have a completely different internet, pioneered in other jurisdictions in the world, which are based on heavy surveillance, very little individual privacy, in which sort of walls are built around the internets. And I think there is a real, as Minister Payne said, there is a real danger that we look back on these days as the heyday of the open internet, and that in the following years, in the coming years, you will see an increasing use of the internet by authoritarian or semi-authoritarian governments to censor speech, surveil individuals, to insist that data cannot flow openly from one jurisdiction to another. And I think that would be a great shame. My own view is that in the long run, we need something close to a sort of Bretton Woods moment of the internet to create the international institutions to really underpin the principles of openness, transparency, accountability, and privacy, which has made the internet such an extraordinary phenomenon in recent years.
Well, if we're looking for guiding principles, the recent Quad statement on tech is probably a good starting point as well. That talks to every phase of design, development, governance, and users needing to be shaped by quote unquote shared democratic values and respect for universal rights. That's, I think, a really big shift from even a decade ago. So, Mr. Clegg, you touched on it there, but how do you see the competition between democracies and authoritarian states playing out, and what sort of issues does that raise for you? You talk about striking that right balance and the chilling effect that you could see from authoritarian states, but there needs to be a balance here, doesn't there? Any idea where that is?
So I was just saying, clearly there needs to be a balance between the ability of the private sector to continue to innovate, to provide these extraordinary products to billions of people around the world, whilst also the right of sovereign governments to establish their own rules. But I think internationally, Dr. Jaishankar talked about the international perspective. I do think there is an increasing standoff really between the open internet, which is widely shared amongst open democratic societies around the world, and a completely different internet paradigm. And I know, President Biden is hosting this, I think it's called Tech for Democracy Summit, I think next month. I very much hope that summits like that will lead to a push to create the institutional and legal underpinnings such that the open internet is preserved going forward. So yes, you need regulation. Yes, of course, the companies need to act with greater accountability and transparency in their operations so that they can be held to account, because with size and success comes responsibility and accountability. But above all, the open data flows and the fundamental principles of privacy and free expression, I do think, are probably under greater threat than many people appreciate.
Dr. Jaishankar, what do you think of that principle of above all? I think that free speech element and the openness of an open global internet needs to be upheld. I want to also touch on what you said last year, that quote unquote technology is very political. What were you talking about when you said that?
Again, I understand the contrast you're making between democratic societies and non-democratic societies. But if we are to do well, it's important that democratic societies find the right balance, because at the end of the day, the power of the example, democracy will advance when it is clear democracy delivers. Now, we can't have the tech world, the data world, essentially run on sort of 19th century principles of capitalism. Yes, on the one hand, we need freedom, we need openness, we need the flows. But on the other hand, there has to be the basic regulations, a sense of equity, a sense of fairness. You can't have data pillaging as a basis for global business. There are countries who would obviously like to build their own businesses. There are people who want to have control over their own data. So I think those also need to be factored in. And we are in a transition right now. Every society, we follow the debates, for example, in Australia, on content. There are regulations, there are countries, Singapore's passed a law, Japan's passed a law. There are debates. We all saw the congressional hearings on the responsibilities of big tech. So I think I don't see these as negatives. I see these as natural practices in a democracy. We have the ability to talk, to differ, to argue. And I'm very, very confident. Because I'm confident about the democracy, I'm confident that this too will eventually be handled in the right way. Now, when the remark about tech being political, I think was made in a certain context. And it is political in the sense that it is used by players to advance goals. Some democratic, some non-democratic. They use it very differently. It is, by the way, we are discussing the tough side of tech. I think in fairness, we should also acknowledge right up front, technology has empowered in a way in which it is inconceivable. I'd be happy to talk about that later. Technology has created efficiencies in a way in which we couldn't have imagined. So there's a lot going for it as well. And those have a lot, when you say democracy delivers, it's also technology in democracies which help deliver.
Indeed, we are talking about the challenges, absolutely, when it comes to tech, and sometimes we can forget about the wonderful things technology and a world that is connected brings to our lives. But Minister Payne, Dr. Jaishankar is right. When you talk about big tech and looking at governments, these are fundamentally democratic organisations, they're democratic principles, but I guess the concern is how these principles and free speech are upheld and are not exploited by authoritarian means. I mean, where is the balance there? As Dr. Jaishankar says, we've probably got time to work that out, but how long?
I think you used the right word, Laura. I think the right word is balanced. And the amount of time available to us is my suggestion is we should be starting yesterday, which in fact is what we are doing in terms of the sorts of conversations and discussions that are being had. And you mentioned the Quad principles. I think broadly speaking, the principles about supporting universal values, building trust, integrity, resilience, a fair and open marketplace are axiomatic, if you like, for this cyber world. But we do have to be very, very clear that the rule of law that applies offline has to apply online. And rules of the road are what enables road users to stay safe. Same with users online. And so in that process, being clear about identifying the difference between free speech and malicious disinformation or online harassment is important. There are rules about how we should act. We've been engaging with multiple partners for some time on these issues, including multilaterally, so through the UN processes and the working groups there, which is about agreeing the rules for how states can and can't behave in cyberspace. And our ambassador for cyber and critical technologies, Dr. Tobias Feakin, is Australia's lead on that. We have multi-stakeholder discussions, and those discussions include governments, the tech companies, and civil society, who look at how we actually address the questions of technical management and governance of the internet and digital technologies. From Australia's perspective, we see this as necessary for all, not just for the privileged few. So we work across the Indo-Pacific as well to invest in capacity building for countries in our region to ensure that they understand the technology landscape and that they can address those challenges. When you think about how important some of the platforms are for fundamental communications, including news communications in the Pacific, for example, being able to understand that, to understand the rules of the road, so to speak, is essential for governments, for civil society, and for individuals. So we have multi-stakeholder governance processes, and that's what we need to be working through together. And I think we can do that without undermining our core principles, which is absolutely essential, because it's the principles that allow us to build that fabric that will hold all of this together.
Well, the Quad is a really good place to start. Fundamental democratic principles being brought into the tech world and then shaping that governance. Mr. Clegg, do you have any big ideas that the private sector can contribute here through the Quad and other security partnerships that might give, that confidence and democratic values in new technologies?
Yeah, I think the private sector has a very, I hope, productive role to play in proposing ideas about how the governance of the online world and how new rules for the online world can be developed. And we're not sitting around. We've published As a company, Meta has published white papers on how you might govern content issues online. We've created our own independent oversight board, which is a wholly independent entity made up of former prime ministers and Nobel Prize laureate, scholars, former journalists, and they adjudicate independently on content disputes on our platform. We work together with governments, as Minister Payne said, governments and other players in the internet. We helped create and fund the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, for instance, which is now an extremely sophisticated cross-industry, multi-stakeholder entity to help us share technologies and share data when terrorist incidents occurs. We were a founding member of the Technology Coalition, which is a global alliance of leading tech firms to come together to build tools and advanced programs to protect children from online sexual exploitation and abuse. There's something called the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, which is being established again across industries to establish a safer and more trustworthy internet. And we've been very open for a good 2 years now that in areas like privacy and data portability and election integrity and content, these are issues which private sector companies should not be left to be deciding on themselves. I mean, it is clearly not right that people like me, or sometimes Mark Zuckerberg and others, are having to make agonizing decisions about whether a piece of content can or can't stay up or stay down according to our own rules, when those rules, of course, they're the rules of a private sector company. These are rules which should be adjudicated upon by legislators. But as I know myself from many years in politics, legislation takes a long time and tech moves very quickly. And I do want to be clear, we really do believe that new regulation, I mean, not all regulation is good. Some of it we agree with, some of it we don't agree with. But of course, new regulation needs to be introduced. This is a very young industry. Meta was well, as it was then formerly known, Facebook was founded, I think, the day after or the week after Roger Federer became #1 in men's tennis, which just shows how young it is. The Federer era is longer than the Facebook Meta era. And yet, a third of the world's population now use it. And yet it sometimes takes 15 years for legislation to finally actually find its way onto the statutes book. So we are not sitting around as an industry. We really are innovating a lot. I think the Oversight Board is a particularly striking new innovation. No one's tried this before in the industry. We're trying to be more transparent. Every 12 weeks, we publish all the data on all the hate speech we take down, on the violence we take down, all the government orders we get. We're going to submit that data, the first company to do so soon, to an independent audit from EY, so that people don't feel that we're marking our own homework. But of course, there's more to do. And we very much hope we can work in responsible partnership with governments who are trying to come up with their own rules, because it's tricky. It's very tricky. It's very tricky to decide where to draw these lines. And something I've discovered is no one ever agrees. I operate in a company where we are shouted at every day by one set of people saying you're not taking down enough content, and other people saying you're censoring too much content. It's a highly polarized kind of, debate.
Well, Mr. Clegg, I know after 20 years in politics, you'll know about the painfully slow pace in which legislation can move. So I know you fully appreciate that. But to play devil's advocate for just a moment, without every jurisdiction or major democratic jurisdictions in the world agreeing on a uniform set of regulation, is Meta or Facebook allowed or able to maintain that governance power? You say, it's not an enviable position to be in, but without, global agreement on some level, is the status quo going to remain?
I think we're going to see over the next few years new legislation in India, in Australia, in the UK, in the EU, possibly in the US too. I think that's obvious. It's all on the books. It's in the pipeline. As I say, some of it I think is really good. Some of it I happen to think is not very good. Some of it is rushed through in anger, and something again I learned over 20 years. Legislating in anger almost always leads to unintended consequences that don't really work out in practice. But a lot of it is sensible and smart and so on. Your question is, will that then in turn lead to a degree of fragmentation as everybody comes up with their own rules? I do think that is a very real danger. And that's why I said earlier, I do think the internet is now owed its sort of Bretton Woods moment, because I think there's some foundational principles amongst democracies on privacy, on transparency, on accountability, on free expression, on open data flows, I think are essential to keep global internet as innovative as it is. And I say particularly in the Asia Pacific region, where the sheer growth and dynamism online is astonishing. I read somewhere the other day that since the beginning of the pandemic, more new people have gone sort of migrated from offline to the online economy in the Asia Pacific region than the total population of the United Kingdom, where I come from. In 2012, in the whole of Asia, there was only 2 tech unicorns worth more than $1 billion. Now there's more than 170. It is growing. I think we'll live in a world one day where the digital economy will be as big, if not bigger, than the real world economy. And so I think the more that the tech democracies can work together, including and notably democracies like Australia and New Zealand, Australia and India, the better that I think new rules could be developed on a multilateral basis.
You were still thinking about the cricket there. We forgive you, Mr. Clegg. But while we're talking about the Asia Pacific, let's talk about China. China is a major player in invention and innovation. Minister Payne, with the birth of that innovation and invention, such as AI, quantum technologies coming from China, does that pose problems or complications for governments in a democracy, do you think?
Laura, I think I will go back to the question about how the rules of the road operate. And it doesn't matter where the technology is derived. If we can come together to agree on the sort of rules of the road that we should be adopting in cyberspace, so online, in that way, then the genesis of the technology should not be the issue. Now, I'm not naive. I understand that is perhaps easier said than done in some ways. And from Australia's perspective, we're very clear about where we think the lines of responsibility lie. Very focused on ensuring that we, in our approach to technology, do walk within those agreed lines, and the work that we do in our multilateral fora, in minilaterals like the Quad itself, and of course bilaterally, is key to that. Making sure that technology is not abused is essential. And the 3 challenges that I identified in response to your earlier questions will be maintained in the context of the development of new technologies. So as quantum technologies grow, as use of artificial intelligence grows, and so on, they will all be consistent through that process, or should be consistent, I should say, through that process.
Dr. Jaishankar, what do you think about the genesis of such tech? Does geographical location matter? And if I could get you to respond to what Minister Payne was saying, as well as Mr. Clegg, about this fragmented approach that we're likely to see.
I'm not sure I would put it in terms of geography. I would put it in terms of in a sense, principles and rules. Look, what are we talking about? We're talking about an era where what's the first thing we all do when we get up in the morning? Okay, we first go and reach out for our phone and see what happens when we were sleeping, how many messages came in. Okay, there's so much of us which is out there as a consequence of this technology revolution that we have seen in the last decade. It's done much more than Roger Federer has done in tennis. And the point is, it then raises to my mind, and not just to my mind, to a whole lot of other people's minds and interests, issues of trust, issues of transparency. If there's so much of me out there because I did it in good faith, I did it as my normal routine, is that being harvested for all said and done legitimate reasons, business reasons, or for more than that? Okay. So I think today, when we are looking at technology choices, technology capabilities, technology partnerships, technology practices, I think these words, trust, transparency, resiliency, reliability, they acquire a very, very strong meaning and relevance. So I do think, we cannot shy away from that. There was a time, again, I now fall back from a tech debate into a classic foreign policy debate.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, we pretended all nations are the same. What happens inside a nation doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you believe. When we come to the table, we are all the same. Now, the fact is, in a much more interpenetrative world, much more globalized world, what you do at home, what you think, how you practice matters too. So I do think values matter. I do think practices matter. I do think issues of trust and transparency matter. And I think that's a very big issue of our era.
Dr. Jaishankar, coming back to the Quad, and I keep on coming back to this because recently it was agreed that technology, quote, shouldn't be misused or abused for authoritarian surveillance and oppression. I think we can all agree that we want democratic values to indeed govern the tech world. It's an obvious guiding principle, but have we seen mission creep, for want of a better term, where we've seen the lines drawn on GPS tracking, facial recognition and mass surveillance, but do we need to redraw them?
Again, in a way, the answer is a political and social answer. I think in all our societies, there will be debates. There will be debates about finding that right balance. There will be debates. How does the government itself use information, control data, what it allows, what it doesn't, what it regulates, how much privacy, should the government intervene, not intervene? I mean, these are natural, look, this is how human societies have evolved, particularly democracy. So I don't think you're going to get a one-time answer. You're not going to get a fix. I think it will be an evolving process. But I am very confident living in a democratic society as a member of parliament in a democratic parliament. I think for all the slowness, the agonizing, I do think there's a value in all of that. Politics may be slow, but slow is another way of describing deliberation. So I think there is value to that. And again, my sense is, look, as democracies today, we should be confident about ourselves. We should be confident about our ability to find the right answers, to get the right balance. And I think technology is one of those issues because the value, I think what Nick said is very important. I mean, after COVID has accelerated digitization. It has shown how better delivery can be with the tools we have. Now, if you have better digital delivery, you also have greater digital risk. And again, we have to find balances for that. So I would hope very much to see a debate. I would hope very much to see a confident debate, not an apprehensive debate.
And you're right, this is so relevant given the last 2 years we've had with COVID. Minister Payne, we've been increasingly asked to give up some privacies for our own protection, it's argued, and that has been true in practice. But some of this, if you look at it in isolation, is not so distinct from practices we've seen in authoritarian states, is it?
Well, I know this is a contentious area, and COVID has exacerbated many of these challenges, as Dr. Jaishankar has just said. But I do think that we're coming from quite different perspectives in the broad, in countries like Australia, than perhaps in authoritarian states. We have a range of oversight mechanisms that are embedded in our democratic institutions, and where governments are thought to have overreached, then I'm acutely aware of the parliamentary processes that are available to oppositions or members and senators in our case, whether that's an estimates process or a questions process or inquiries, whatever that might be. And I'm a senator in the Australian Parliament. I'm a great advocate of the work that is done through these processes and have been for over 2 decades. We also have the operation of the rule of law that provides a level of accountability in countries like Australia. There are penalties under the laws that pertain in our countries for those who misuse technology. We are also required to be and have endeavoured to be transparent about how government uses technology. As I said, robust public debates through the Parliament, through our free press, through free speech. So I think there are clear distinctions there. And I would also say that we as governments have not advocated the use of the cover of COVID, if you like, to entrench stronger security measures, and we would reject that being done. Where there are contact tracing phone apps, for example, or QR code registration apps. The process there is to be single purpose, to be proportionate, and importantly, to be temporary. And I know there are discussions about how long those sorts of actions continue here in Australia as we transition through the worst difficulties of the COVID period into a different context in Australia. So I do think there are quite different underpinnings for both in both those systems that you've raised.
Mr. Clegg, perhaps it's not as not extreme, but as overt as GPS tracking, facial recognition, mass surveillance, but even things like controlling your own Facebook feed. I mean, perhaps Minister Payne is suggesting Facebook needs its own parliament.
Well, as I say, not quite a parliament, but we do have something which has binding and independent powers now over some of these sensitive content decisions that we have to adjudicate on, namely this oversight board. And no one's tried this before. It's early days, but I have to say, a year or so after it's first launched, I think it's a really promising initiative, pending perhaps fuller legislation to ensure these companies are held to account. But to the point that you just made about and also Mr. Jashankar said the importance that people feel they have confidence and trust in their own online experience. We've talked a lot about regulation, governance, private sector, accountability, and so on and so forth. We mustn't forget one of the most important things is to give individuals as much control as possible over their own experience. And I do think that's where companies like Meta are on a journey. I mean, you can now, if you're using the Facebook app, you can override the algorithm. You can block certain ads. You can go on these little 3 dots, which you see on the top right-hand corner of every post, seeing why are you seeing this, which explains why you're seeing the ads, why you're seeing that post. You can basically compose your own news feed by singling out the pages that are your favorites. So there is actually quite a lot of control. Then there's a debate about whether the controls are easy enough to use, are they visible enough to use, and so on. But my own view is that the future of the online world, not only do you require regulation, not only do you need to have greater transparency from the companies on everything from their algorithmic ranking systems to the kind of, debate about hate speech that we were talking about earlier, but you also need to give individuals really granular controls. And I would love to see one day Facebook users more or less being able to kind of dial up. Do you want to see more sport or less sport, more politics or less politics, more cooking or less cooking? I don't know whether those are the right categories, but I do think given that social media is a highly personalized experience, every single person's new Facebook news feed is individual to them. It's like a sort of digital fingerprint. No news feed is the same to another, which is why it's so utterly different to the traditional media. It's not. You're not reading the same front page. You're, in a sense, you're almost creating your own. And I think over time, what you'll see is that people, I hope, and people who experience social media will have more and more control about exactly how that's curated and how that's architected and how that's designed.
Perhaps cooking is one of the least controversial parts of a Facebook feed, but I understand what you're saying. Now, to all of you, where does this lead us when it comes to our relationship with China? I mean, do we expect China is going to change its tune? Does it need to change its tune with the way things are at the moment? Dr. Jaishankar, what do you think about this and China's view of tech governance?
Well, obviously, they have practices which are different from that followed by many, at least the countries on the screen that we are looking at. I think that's reflective of a larger system. So I don't think you're asking a tech question, you're asking a systemic question.
Minister Payne, you've said that Australia and India are like-minded countries, and this is a quote from you, I wish to read it back to you, will lead the international discourse on critical technologies, advocate for standards and norms that reflect our interests and values and define what is and what is not acceptable. What are the things that are not acceptable? Do you have a list of red line issues?
Laura, I think there are a few that fall into that category, and some of them we have already discussed in our exchanges today. Where there are arbitrary incursions on liberties, where there's the use of dangerous disinformation, where there's the theft of intellectual property, or malicious cyber activity, cyber behaviour to undermine stability. They are pretty clearly unacceptable. There are red lines, I guess, that are broadly agreed. Technology being used to perpetrate disinformation, social disharmony, or as a propaganda tool. But I think the best antidote to disinformation, frankly, is sunlight. And I'm a strong advocate of the application of sunlight, but also the production and the promotion of accurate and transparent information from credible sources. And I do note exactly in the same terms as Mr. Clegg has outlined, the takedowns that have occurred during the COVID period in particular, and made some remarks on this earlier last year. The takedowns that have occurred in the COVID period have been immensely important. The discussions led at the United Nations, including by countries like Latvia, who have focused on this, immensely important in the application of sunlight as well. So in my department, we've established a task force that works through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade on disinformation, to preempt it, to deter, to respond, because we know exactly how dangerous it can be, and we know we need to help to build regional resilience against it. And vaccines have been the best and worst example of this that I have seen, and certainly during the last months, as vaccines have been a subject of great discussion, I've made sure that we're very focused on that.
Indeed. Mr. Clegg, in this discussion, you've described Facebook as being on a journey. I think we all are when it comes to the emergence of technology. Is part of the problem for Facebook is that it's a virtual monopoly. Without serious competition, it needs to rely heavily on governance, but democracies aren't keeping up with those advancements. So in many ways, you're a victim of your own success.
Well, Meta is clearly, highly successful in the sense that a lot of people use WhatsApp and Messenger and Instagram and Facebook around the world, but there are a dizzying array of choices. I mean, just look at the explosive growth. I mean, really far more rapid than Facebook or Instagram grew as social media apps. Look at the explosive growth of TikTok over the last couple of years. Or look at the way that, YouTube is far, far bigger in terms of video consumption than any of our apps. Or in messaging, iMessage is a far bigger messaging app in the United States, where I'm sat at the moment, than any of our messaging apps. So whether it's photos, videos, messaging, many of them, of course, you can use with no upfront charge, because in our case, they're paid for from advertising. So I think it's actually a highly fluid and dynamic sector, because as TikTok's example has shown, you can erupt on the scene and the network effects can allow new market entrants to grow very rapidly. But that does of course contrast with, since you asked, with the Chinese market. We're not allowed to operate in the Chinese market, so I can't speak for any our apps. People in China can't use Facebook, Instagram, and so on and so forth. But let's be clear that the Chinese paradigm of the internet is exceptionally successful, but exceptionally different to the open internet we're talking about. It's exceptionally successful because they've created their own. I mean, Alibaba, Tencent, all of these are rivaling the big Silicon Valley giants, and are doing so in an exceptionally sort of forceful way. But it's based on a completely different intellectual paradigm. It's based on keeping, including the apps that we have, out of the market. It's based on very heavy surveillance inside the market. And I can see why other jurisdictions, and particularly authoritarian or semi-authoritarian jurisdictions, might find it a more attractive paradigm. But I don't think that's, I think that's perhaps another reason why the great sort of techno-democracies in the world, I do think, need to cooperate more and more together in order to create multilateral international standards which can withstand the pressures and the challenge of that wholly different paradigm.
Okay, we've got some questions from our delegates now that go to a lot of things we've already discussed on the panel today. This, Andrew from New York, industries that have previously required wholesale regulation such as tobacco, air travel, motor vehicle, food safety, etc., have found it a bumpy road, he says. It's in everyone's best interest to have a strong and innovative tech sector and effective regulation. How do you see a reset that moves beyond the catchphrases of accountability, transparency and governance to put some of these principles into practice? Again, it's something that we have explored here today, but Dr. Jaishankar, why don't you kick it off?
Look, I'm not sure I agree with even the premise of that question. I mean, just think about it. What would happen in air-to-air travel if there wasn't regulation in air travel? What would happen to shipping if there wasn't regulation in shipping? In fact, these are exactly the examples which make a case why you need a larger global understanding and more, some kind of efficient regulation rules of the road, if you would. And I don't think accountability, transparency, and governance are catchphrases. I think there are real issues out there. I mean, I made the point earlier. Look, we can't have a laissez-faire sort of let whatever happens happen kind of approach to something that is today so important in our lives.
Minister Payne, your view on that?
I think we're in warm agreement on these issues. International standard settings bodies have been very important, particularly in some of the examples that the questioner has used in their proposition. And it might be a bumpy road, but that doesn't make it unimportant, and it doesn't make it not worth travelling to achieve an outcome. In those sectors, we have most definitely, as Dr. Jaishankar says, seen the benefit of regulation. We need to ensure balance. I think in all of our comments today, one or other of us at some time has used the word balance. We recognise that, but there is still a responsibility that we have to address these questions from the perspective of government, from the perspective of technology platforms, and of course from the views of civil society and the community as well.
Mr. Clegg, this one for you from Evelyn. The question, how can technology platforms increase public transparency to improve government and society's understanding of their impact?
Through transparency, I think we need to release more and more data. We need to provide more access to researchers to do their own research, using our data. We have 1,000 PhDs working in Meta, for instance, and they publish, I think we've published already over 400 peer-reviewed or academic papers, scientific papers during the course of this year. Alone, we're cooperating, for instance, with, I think, 17 academics, giving them unparalleled access to our data to examine, for instance, how social media played a role in voter behavior in the run-up to the last US 2020 presidential election. So more research, more data. As I say, we've now published, we publish all the data on hate speech, on nudity, on violence, all the things that break our rules. What do we identify? What do we catch? What do we not catch? How are we doing in different categories? We've recently started publishing a new report which lists the most viewed content on Facebook and Instagram, because there's a lot of ongoing commentary and claim and counterclaim about what people are actually seeing on these social media apps, which often don't actually bear very much relationship to the reality. So I think we as a company have an incentive to be more transparent. I think legislation, by the way, and rules and regulation would help in this respect. I'll give you a very specific example. one of the tensions we find is that academics want to get hold of data that we have to do their own research. But of course, the more data that leaves the building, the greater the risk there is to individual privacy, because the more data moves around, the more candidly there's a risk that it gets lost. We can't make, as a private sector company, that adjudication between the value of data portability versus the risk, which undoubtedly then increases to privacy. That has to be done by lawmakers and legislators in democratic legislatures. So that would be a great example where we could do more, we should do more, and actually having some rules of the road would help us to do more of what I think everybody wants us to do more of.
Dr. Jaishankar, is that a solution that would be within India's reach to be able to provide for private researchers to be able to get that data within the framework that you can set out?
First of all, I just wanted to add to what Nick Clegg said. I mean, in a sense, what technology platforms have done, I mean, he mostly addressed how they are getting more transparent. We should also recognize they're helping governmental processes, social processes get more transparent. And if you today look, I'm giving you the Indian experience. We do a very, very large number of financial transfers. Okay. We run big programs where either you put money into people's accounts or you pay them for work which is done by them. Now, in the past, a lot, when we were doing it the old-fashioned way, frankly, a lot of these transfers used to disappear, and it is generally said that the recipient got 15% of what the government sent out to them. Today, because of technology platforms, actually, there are direct benefits which are moving seamlessly. Through the entire COVID period, we were able to do financial transfers and even food support to literally hundreds of millions of people because of technology platforms. We could vaccinate. I mean, we vaccinated more than 1 billion people. I mean, we can pull out for you literally stay region by region, block by block, village by village, maybe even street by street, who's vaccinated and when is their second shot due, and send them a reminder saying your second shot is due. Now, so what it has done is it's had an absolutely amazing impact on actually the quality of governance. And I would say particularly in democracies, where it's very important that the credibility of the democracy is based on its ability to deliver good governance. This is something which has been hugely helpful. So I do want to make the point that technology platforms have actually strengthened democracies, provided democracies have known how to use them well.
Minister Payne, that's something, of course, we've experienced here in Australia as well, COVID-19 with the vaccination. What Dr. Jaishankar is talking about is the lived experience here in Australia. So you agree with that premise that even through COVID-19, I think these platforms and technology has shown that with mass amounts of data, there is a responsibility that can be upheld.
And that's the second quad principle about trust, integrity and resilience, which we've been articulating right through this discussion, yes.
Another question we've got here is from Maya in Canberra. The question is, do democracies need to form alliances, multilateral forums to promote essential democratic values for global technology governance? Now, we've talked about the Quad, we've talked about the G20. Is what Maya saying separate to these bodies that we already have, strong relationships within? Can we do it within these groups, Minister Payne, or does there need to be a separate system set up?
Well, I think we can and we do it within those groups, but there are also UN-based working groups which are broadly engaged on these issues, the open-ended working group and one other in particular, and that is the work that we must continue to do, and we must use multiple approaches because I don't think one single approach covers enough ground or absorbs enough players. So that is to use multilateral, as I said before, the minilateral and bilateral agreements. Australia and the Republic of Korea signed an MOU on cyber just in the last 6 weeks when I was in Seoul recently. And then ensuring that we keep these contemporary as well. I mean, Nick Clegg made the observation about the pace of change that we deal with across platforms. I know that one of the estimates floating around is that half of the next billion internet users will be Indian alone.
Wow.
That in and of itself is a very powerful statistic about where critical mass is and what change looks like and how fast it is being driven and in what volumes. So staying contemporary through all of these engagements is essential. And being dynamic, therefore, and responsive to change, and doing that across multiple levels, as I said, essential.
Yeah. Dr. Jaishankar, what do you think about the best multilateral approach here? If there's an established body, Maurice Payne suggested that, in working groups. I mean, I think you'd agree that there's not one body in which you can get all of this done, but is there a group in which you would suggest?
No, look, I'm in full agreement with her. I think the issue is too complicated for it to be dealt with by a small group or a particular body. I think we're looking at a sort of all of the above answer. And I would even say this, look, there may be countries and societies whose practices could be very different, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily get into a sharply confrontational situation. I think somewhere we have to find right domestic balances. I think we also have to find ways of enlarging this conversation and trying to see how we can address this larger issue in a much more responsible way. I know it's much easier said than done, but I do think it's something which needs to be tried.
Mr. Clegg, a question here from Swetha. How can governments better understand the kinds of interventions and governance that are needed, given much of what occurs in technology companies is opaque to the outside? We've talked about this, that Facebook and Meta in particular is trying to become more transparent, but perhaps you could talk to the ways and the plans in which Meta has to be able to remove some of that opacity, if you like.
Well, I think I'd be at risk of repeating myself, Laura. I just think it's provide more data to researchers, publish more data. We now publish data in exactly the same cadence as our financial results. So every 12 weeks we publish all the data on all the takedown, the content that we've taken down. We publish the rate at which our own systems, principally our AI and automated systems, identify that content before it's reported to us. So for instance, terrorist content is now, I think over 99% of terrorist content is now identified by our own AI systems before it's reported to us by a human being. That is quite different to what it was 5 or 7 years ago. And we're getting much, much better at, for instance, reducing the prevalence of hate speech. I mentioned earlier, the prevalence of hate speech now stands at 0.03%. The quarter before that, it was 0.05%. The quarter before that, it was 0.07%. I don't think it's ever going to be completely 0%. But so we try to hold ourselves to account in that way. And I suspect in keeping with the new generation of regulation that is likely to hit the statute books in many jurisdictions in the way that we've talked about, I'm sure there'll be further requirements, for instance, on greater algorithmic transparency. I think my own view is a lot of interesting things are said about algorithms, and a lot of very silly things are said about algorithms. They don't sort of burrow into our neural pathways and make us do, feel, and say things that we otherwise wouldn't. I mean, sometimes I see these ranking algorithms described as sort of lizard-like entities that sort of force us to do things we otherwise wouldn't do. It's not that kind of science fiction. But I do think companies like Meta, we should be obliged to provide greater clarity on how we design the ranking algorithms. What signals do we use? What outputs are we looking for in using those algorithms? I think all of that is to come. Can I just say one final thing on the previous question? I think we've got a number of you've got standard setting institutions like the ITU, ICANN. I think, by the way, I think the OECD and the G20 have done a great job recently in pioneering new tax rules for the digital world to make sure that companies like Meta, we pay our fair share in tax around the world. But I do think there is a gap. I really do think there's a multilateral gap. That's why I keep going back to this sort of Bretton Woods spirit. I don't think we have the institutions and the machinery, the institutional machinery globally to really introduce proper governance of the online space on a multilateral basis. So my view is that at some point we will need to revisit the kind of international institutions we require, because they don't really exist at the moment.
Mr. Clegg, question without notice, was it more difficult navigating the British Parliament back in 2010 to 2015, or your job now?
I think probably British politics remains uniquely ferocious.
Before we go down that rabbit hole, I have one last question from our delegate, and goes to the entire panel. It's from Michelle. Should technology governance aim to meet the minimum standards or improve society? And she has an example. She says, for example, should it not replicate bias against racial groups, or should it decrease it? Maurice Payne, first to you.
Thanks, Laura. This has been a really interesting discussion, so I very much appreciate the participation of all of our friends on screen and of your hosting, Laura. I think we should always be asking ourselves what should be done with technology, not just what can be done with technology. When we use technologies to uphold and protect our values in the observance of international law, they can add to safer, more secure and more inclusive societies that are able to that drive greater economic growth, that drive greater innovation. I think ensuring that bias of any kind, ensuring that we maintain that that is unacceptable, whether it's on race or gender, socioeconomic position. There are multiple areas in which it is unacceptable. We need to continually address that from governments, from business, from civil society and from individuals alike. I fear that it is of course a difficult area of endeavour. One of the things that concerns me about the pace of technology and engagement is where it breaks down usual boundaries of courtesies and respect, and I fear that a lot of that is lost. And I don't say that because I'm so old that that's all I can hark back to, the concepts of respect and boundaries, but because it's actually what gives us a civilised society, genuinely a civilised society. And we should be able to expect civilised society online as we should expect it offline, frankly.
As my mother would say, manners never go out of fashion. Dr. Jayashankar, this final question, if I could get you to respond to it.
Well, since they don't go out of fashion, let me begin by joining Maurice and thanking you for hosting us today. Look, I just think that this is today, technologies become such a powerful force of change in our lives that we shouldn't have a minimalistic view of how to approach it and its consequences. On the contrary, it should be something much more ambitious, much more maximalist, if you would. The fact that we are today debating these issues of bias, issues of sovereignty, issues of privacy, issues of transparency, I think is a very good sign. The world has always progressed. Whenever there's been a big change, the argumentation of the world has also evolved along with it. I think that's what we are going to see. The governance of the world has evolved along with it. I do think, we are in for exciting times, very energetic, even ferocious debates, but I think that's the way to go.
We love a ferocious debate. We've had one here today, and furious agreement must be said as well. Mr. Clegg, finally to you.
Well, I think technology, certainly communications technology, and certainly social media, it allows for the more rapid circulation of the good, but also the bad. If you look at virality on social media, that is what is that didn't exist before, and it means that and thankfully the vast majority of content that is on social media is good, it's innocent, it's playful, it's positive, it's small businesses making a living, it's people organizing their daughters' football games, it's local communities getting together. But of course, the problem is that ease of circulation, of course, is also available to people who have bad intent. And so the job of both the industry and government is to mitigate the bad. You'll never eliminate it. You'll never eliminate it in the same way that in a free society, you're never going to eliminate crime, but you want to try and get it down to the absolute minimum level that's sort of acceptable in society. You have to try and do that online whilst amplifying the good. And that's where a lot of the sort of difficult, really difficult ethical and cultural and social debates come into play, because who is to decide what is good and bad? I mean, most of the debate that I'm involved in isn't actually about illegal speech at all. It's perfectly legal speech, but that people just deem to be unpleasant or hateful or offensive. And that's a really, it's a moral minefield, because you're asking, certainly in the case of the company Meta, you're asking a private sector company to wade deep into basically moderating and acting against content that is perfectly legal. And that's where you get a lot of the tensions, because companies like Meta are shouted at. Why don't you do more, to take down X, Y, Z, to make everything nicer and to make it, to make society better? And we're saying, well, yeah, fine, but that's kind of not what the law of the land says. Do you really want us to take the law in our own hands? And that's where I think, back to the theme of the whole event, the more that we have clear, democratically agreed guardrails that we all agree on, the better for society at large.
Indeed, it is a minefield, and I thank you all for entering it with me today. Mr. Clegg, thank you. Dr. Jaishankar and Minister Payne, really appreciate your time. Hopefully we can do this again soon to see where we all get up to. Appreciate it. And that is all we have time for today. I want to thank all of our panellists, brilliant panellists, for their contributions, and thank our Sydney Dialogue audience for tuning in. I'm also pleased to announce that this session is being streamed at the Bengaluru Tech Summit, BTS. The convergence of dates, themes and sessions between BTS and the Sydney Dialogue speaks to deepening bilateral ties between Australia and India, and our shared interests in working with like-minded countries to shape the norms and the rules underpinning emerging technologies. Don't forget, you can continue the conversation. We urge you to do so on Twitter. Use the hashtag TSD2021. Thank you so much for joining us again today, and I hope we see you again soon.